Hi guys, Dr. Rachel Hippolyte here. So today I want to talk about a rigid brain, okay? Now, a rigid brain I see a lot in my line of work, and a lot of what we're doing with neurofeedback and retraining the brain is about reducing the rigidity of that brain and allowing it to be more flexible and more resilient. So when I talk about a rigid brain, we're talking about the automatic pathways that it's learned from its past, and it's doing those automatic pathways, whether that's a thought, whether that's a feeling, and it's doing those pathways automatically without thinking. It's doing it without relating it to the environment or your internal, which means that it's very rigid, which means that it's not adapting to a changing environment. And when we live in the life that we live, when we need to have a nice flexible brain that deals well with change. And almost every single client that I have, and myself included, have a rigid brain. And it's that rigid brain which makes life difficult. It's that rigid brain which means that we don't deal well with change. It's that rigid brain that means that we'll see what somebody else says, does, thinks as a threat because it's perhaps not along our line of thinking. And a rigid brain really just means that it's making life incredibly difficult for us. Now, when we talk about neurofeedback and brain training, we're talking about neuroplasticity. Your brain learns and it builds neurological pathways based on those learnings, but it has to be continually learning and being dynamical and looking at those pathways to check that they're relevant to your life now. Now, so many people that I see, they're running these automatic pathways, their brain isn't thinking about it based on things that may have happened in their life, and it means that they're not adaptable to the surroundings that they live in now. Anxiety is a perfect example of that. PTSD is a perfect example of that. The brain is just firing off these neurological pathways automatically without relating them to the environment that they're in this moment. And what neurofeedback does is it retrains the brain to look at those pathways, to assess whether they're relevant for now, and to often take an easier option, a healthier option, because those rigid pathways, more often than not, aren't actually energy efficient. And it's actually incredibly hard for the brain to do, but it doesn't know any better option. It feels like it's doing it because it's the right thing, and it hasn't actually had to assess whether it's the right thing in this moment for a long time. And so what neurofeedback does is it gives the brain information and allows it to look in the moment at whether those automatic pathways are actually relevant and the best option to your life now. And what we see then happening is we see the brain becoming more flexible, becoming more resilient, becoming more adaptable to the environment that we live. So negative thinking is a perfect example of a very rigid brain. Depression, anxiety, very good, and PTSD, very good examples of rigid brains that aren't adaptable to the life that they live now. And when we retrain the brain with better information, it builds those new neurological pathways that are more relevant to now. Now, since brain training, I am so much more flexible to changes that happen. I'm able to look at them logically rather than with fear. Life is always going to be throwing curveballs, and when we have a rigid brain, we actually really don't deal with those curveballs very well, and they cause the emotional brain to just light up and try and grab some sort of control, the only control that we have. Whereas when we have a flexible brain, a resilient brain, we're able to look at things a little bit more logically. We're able to look at the environment, the situation a bit more logically to be able to see the best option, because more often than not, fear is not the best option. It doesn't change an outcome, it just makes things pretty miserable for us. So neurotraining or brain training, neurological feedback allows our brains to grow and adapt to a changing environment, to be more flexible. And once we have a flexible brain, it is so much easier to be happier. It's so much easier to see things more positively. When curveballs do come our way, it's a lot more easy to see a way out, to see the best option to fix the situation. And I see this every single day in every single one of my clients. Maybe in 2 treatments, it may be in 20 treatments, depending on how easily their brain learns. And we do find the really, really rigid brains tend to take a little bit long to learn, but they all do finally learn. So that's a rigid brain, and that's how a rigid brain just causes harm, unhappiness to the person, and pretty much every single client I have that is struggling with their mental health, whether that's anxiety, depression, poor focus, PTSD, DPDR, any of those symptoms, every single one of these brains is rigid and is just throwing neurological pathways automatically that it's learned from the past that aren't actually benefiting you and aren't actually relevant in your life now. So the one thing that neuro brain training does give you is a nice, healthy, flexible brain that allows you to adapt to your environment and the changes that are happening in your environment, your situation, people, those kind of things. It doesn't make you happy all the time. It makes you a lot more positive, and it allows you to see things that happen to you a lot more logically, to be able to then make changes to adapt yourself to those situations. Okay, right, hope that makes sense. Please message below if anyone has any questions regarding neurofeedback and how it can help you, whether it can help you, and how it may be able to help your brain become more flexible, more resilient, and lose those negative automatic pathways that may actually not be benefiting you and are probably harming you because they're stopping you living that happy, healthy, safe life that you deserve. Okay, guys.